I was standing at baggage claim in JFK Airport when the text message came through. Do not bother going back to your studio. Your parents just sold your little company for $4 million to fund your brother's startup. All your art supplies are in a storage unit. I did not cry or scream. I just smiled, hailed an Uber, and headed straight to the upscale Manhattan restaurant where they were celebrating the sale of a company that they did not actually own. My name is Audrey. I am 33 years old, and I am the CEO of a digital art licensing firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had a toxic family member who tried to take credit for your hard work and steal your success. I had just landed after spending 6 months at a prestigious art residency in Paris. My flight was delayed and I was exhausted. For weeks, my mother Diane had promised that the whole family would be waiting at the terminal to welcome me. I scanned the crowded arrivals hall looking for my parents or my brother Bradley. There was no one, just strangers hugging loved ones. Then my phone buzzed. It was not an apology. It was a message from my 29-year-old sister-in-law, Zoe. Zoe is a Black African-American woman who married my brother 2 years ago. From the moment she joined the family, she made it clear she expected a life of luxury. She constantly bragged about designer brands all funded by my parents. Her text message was dripping with the smug satisfaction she reserved specifically for me. She explained my parents had liquidated my studio space. They sold the LLC that operated my design studio to a wealthy tech investor named Trenton. The $4 million payout was being funneled into Bradley's new artificial intelligence startup. Zoe attached a photo of herself holding champagne at a fancy restaurant, with a caption saying "Family supports family." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The audacity of it was staggering. My brother Bradley is 30 years old and has never held a steady job. He is the classic golden child. While I spent my 20s building my portfolio and finalizing digital licensing contracts, Bradley bounced from one failed venture to another. My parents bailed him out every single time. To them, my lucrative career as a digital artist was just a cute little hobby. Bradley's half-baked tech ideas were always treated as the work of an undiscovered genius. Anyone else might have broken down in tears right there next to the baggage carousel. Finding out your parents sold your business out from under you to fund the golden child is a devastating betrayal. But I did not feel devastated. I felt a cold, sharp sense of victory. Zoe and my parents were so blinded by their greed that they never bothered to look into the actual legal structure of my business. They assumed they had all the power. They were wrong. I grabbed my heavy suitcases and walked out into the crisp New York air. I did not call them crying. I did not type out an angry response to Zoe. I simply opened my ride-sharing app and requested an Uber Black. When the sleek black car pulled up to the curb, the driver asked where I was heading. I read the name of the restaurant from Zoe's photo. It was an extremely exclusive spot in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of place where businessmen close multi-million-dollar deals over steaks and expensive wine. During the 45-minute drive into the city, I watched the skyline approach and mentally reviewed the terms of my corporate contracts. My mother had co-signed for my initial LLC years ago when I was just starting out, which gave her a delusional sense of ownership. She actually believed that piece of paper gave her the right to sell my life away. She had no idea what she had actually sold to this man Trenton. The Uber pulled up to the curb outside the expensive restaurant. The valet quickly opened my door and I stepped out onto the cold pavement. Through the large glass windows, I could clearly see them laughing and drinking wine. My mother, my father Bradley, and Zoe were all sitting comfortably at a prime corner table. Sitting right next to them was Trenton, the wealthy investor who thought he had just bought my life. I adjusted my heavy coat, took a deep breath, prepared my absolute best fake smile, and confidently walked through the heavy front doors to destroy their perfect evening. The hostess tried to intercept me, but I walked straight past her podium toward the back corner of the dining room. The clinking of crystal glasses and loud laughter from my family guided me right to their table. Zoe was the first to notice my arrival. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a deep scowl as she nudged my brother. Bradley looked up, his face pale for a brief second before he masked it with arrogant annoyance. My parents stopped mid-laugh. Trenton, the stranger sitting at the head of the table, looked confused by the sudden drop in temperature. Before anyone else could speak, my mother Diane slammed her wineglass down on the crisp white tablecloth. She did not bother keeping her voice low. The neighboring tables immediately turned their heads to watch the drama unfold. "Audrey, what are you doing here?" my mother snapped, adjusting her expensive silk scarf. "We told you your things are in storage. Do not come in here and make a scene. We are conducting serious business." I stood tall and kept my voice perfectly level. "It is interesting that you call selling my company, without my knowledge, serious business, Mom." My mother scoffed loudly, waving her hand in the air to dismiss me. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Audrey. I paid $15,000 to co-sign your LLC when you were 20 years old. I own 51% on paper. I had every legal right to liquidate those assets. Your brother is a tech genius who needs the capital to change the world. You just draw pictures on an iPad. You can do that in a coffee shop." The sheer disrespect in her words hung in the air, but I refused to give her the emotional reaction she desperately wanted. Instead, I turned my attention to the man sitting next to my father. He wore a tailored custom suit and had the smug aura of a man who thought he was the smartest person in the room. "You must be Trenton," I said, extending my hand. "I am Audrey, the person who actually built the company you just wired $4 million to buy." Trenton shook my hand tentatively, looking back and forth between me and my mother. Diane quickly jumped in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, as she tried to regain control of the narrative. "Yes, Trenton. This is my daughter Audrey. She handles the little graphic design projects for the studio. But as we discussed, Bradley is the real visionary of the family." I looked at my 30-year-old brother, who was suddenly avoiding my gaze and staring intensely at his expensive Wagyu steak. "A visionary," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue with a hint of amusement. "Trenton, did they tell you about Bradley's previous visionary projects? Like the premium dog food delivery service that went bankrupt in 3 months? Or perhaps the cryptocurrency trading platform he launched last year that lost $200,000 of my parents' retirement savings?" Bradley's face flushed bright red. "Shut up, Audrey," he hissed, slamming his fist on the table. "You do not know anything about artificial intelligence or scaling a tech startup." I smiled warmly at him. "You are absolutely right, Bradley. I do not know anything about artificial intelligence. But I do know how to secure multi-million-dollar licensing contracts with Fortune 500 companies, which is what my little graphic design projects have been doing for the last 5 years." Trenton shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at my father, Richard, who had remained entirely silent up until this point. Richard cleared his throat and tried to sound authoritative. "Audrey, this family has supported you for years. It is time you gave something back. Bradley is going to take this family to the next level. We had to make a strategic financial decision." "A strategic financial decision?" I nodded slowly, pretending to agree with them. "I suppose taking $4 million for an LLC is a great financial move for you." I am just surprised Trenton here was so eager to part with his money without wanting to meet the primary revenue generator first. Trenton puffed out his chest, clearly feeling challenged. "I had my legal team look over the ownership documents, Audrey. Your mother was the majority shareholder of the LLC. The intellectual property and client list come with the acquisition. It is just business, nothing personal." I looked at Trenton, then at my mother, whose face was glowing with triumphant satisfaction. They all genuinely believed they had outsmarted me. They thought they had trapped me in a corner and stolen my life's work to fund my brother's delusions of grandeur. I decided to just play along with them tonight. I pulled an empty chair from the adjacent table and sat down, uninvited. The waiter immediately rushed over, looking panicked by the sudden tension, but I simply ordered a glass of sparkling water. As the waiter hurried away, my sister-in-law Zoe leaned across the table. The sparkling chandeliers above us caught the dazzling reflection of a brand new thick Cartier diamond necklace resting on her collarbone. I knew exactly how much that specific piece cost, and I knew exactly whose money had paid for it. Zoe flipped her long, dark braids over her shoulder and offered me a condescending smile. "Honestly, Audrey, you should be thanking us," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You have been struggling with that little art hobby of yours for years. Now, your little drawings have actually contributed to something meaningful. Bradley is building the future, and I am stepping in as the chief marketing officer to ensure our brand reaches a global scale. You should be grateful your little hobby funded a real business." I stared at her for a long moment. Zoe had never marketed anything in her life other than her own social media profiles. The idea of her managing a multi-million-dollar tech brand was laughable, but I kept my expression entirely neutral. "Chief Marketing Officer," I repeated softly. "That is a very impressive title, Zoe. It must come with a very impressive salary to afford that stunning Cartier necklace you are wearing. Did Trenton here approve that as a corporate expense, or did you just pull it directly from the buyout funds before the ink was even dry?" Zoe instinctively reached up and touched the diamonds, her eyes darting toward Trenton for a second. Bradley aggressively cleared his throat and wrapped his arm around his wife. "That is none of your business, Audrey," he snapped. "We are celebrating our success tonight. You are just bitter because you never had the vision to scale a company. We took what you failed to utilize and turned it into an empire. Now be a good sister and let us enjoy our evening or leave." My glass of sparkling water arrived. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch out. My father crossed his arms, looking stern. My mother rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about my constant need for attention. They were so incredibly predictable. They spent their entire lives treating me like the family scapegoat, assuming I would just absorb their abuse and quietly retreat to my room. They thought stripping me of my business would finally break my spirit and force me to bow to Bradley's supposed superiority. I placed my glass back on the table and stood up, smoothing the front of my coat. "I am not bitter at all, Bradley," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the ambient noise of the restaurant. "In fact, I am relieved. Running a business is stressful, and now I do not have to worry about the heavy burden of managing that specific limited liability company anymore. You and Mom took it right off my hands." I turned my gaze away from my family and locked eyes with Trenton. He had been quietly observing the entire exchange, his arrogance slowly shifting into something resembling calculation. He was a wealthy investor, which meant he had decent instincts, and right now those instincts were telling him that something in this family dynamic was deeply wrong. "Trenton," I said, leaning forward just slightly, "it was a pleasure meeting you. You seem like a smart man, an experienced businessman. So, as a professional courtesy, I will give you a piece of advice. I really hope your corporate lawyers actually read the fine print of what they bought today. Because in my experience, when someone sells you a company they did not build, they usually forget to include the most valuable parts." Trenton's brow furrowed. He opened his mouth to ask what I meant, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and dropped it onto the table next to my untouched glass of sparkling water. "Congratulations on your new empire, Bradley," I said cheerfully. "Good luck with the marketing, Zoe." I turned and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. I did not need to see their faces to know the exact effect my words had caused. The loud celebratory laughter that had filled their corner of the dining room just 10 minutes ago was completely gone. As I pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped back out into the cold New York night, the only thing I left behind at that table was a sudden, suffocating, and incredibly nervous silence. The night air felt refreshing as I stepped into the waiting Uber. I gave the driver the address to my Upper West Side apartment. It was a modest one-bedroom place I had rented since my early 20s. Because my income was unpredictable back then, my parents had co-signed the lease. I paid every month of rent myself, but that signature gave them legal access. I leaned my head against the window, watching the city lights blur past, knowing exactly what kind of retaliation was waiting for me. When the elevator doors opened on my floor, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated a familiar figure standing down the hallway. It was my father, Richard. He was crouched in front of my door with a cordless drill, actively removing the brass deadbolt to install a new one. Two heavy-duty garbage bags were sitting next to his feet. I walked slowly down the carpeted hallway, the sound of my heels echoing off the walls. My father stopped drilling and stood up to face me. He had rushed over the second my mother texted him from the restaurant. His expression was stern, attempting to project the ultimate patriarchal authority that he always relied on to keep me in line. "I suppose Mom sent you to execute the punishment phase of the evening," I said, stopping a few feet away from him. My father pointed a thick finger at my chest. "You embarrassed your mother and your brother in front of a major investor tonight, Audrey. This family has sacrificed everything to give you a foundation. We co-signed this apartment. We co-signed your business, and this is how you repay us, by acting like a spoiled, jealous child." I glanced down at the black plastic bags. "Are those my things?" "Just your clothes and toiletries," he replied coldly. "The furniture and the electronics stay. Consider them collateral. You are officially cut out of this family, Audrey. You are not welcome in this apartment, and you are not welcome at our home unless you apologize and fully support your brother's vision. Bradley is taking this family to the next level, and if you try to sabotage his tech startup, I will personally see to it that you are left with absolutely nothing. Now take your trash bags and go find a hotel." He crossed his arms, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He expected me to cry. He expected me to drop to my knees and beg him not to take away my home. He wanted me to promise that I would hand over my intellectual property to Trenton just to get my apartment keys back. Instead of begging, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen, dialed a number I had saved in my favorites, and put the call on speakerphone so my father could hear every single word. A crisp, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Elite Concierge Moving Services, this is David speaking. How may I assist you tonight, Ms. Audrey?" "Hi, David," I said cheerfully. "I need an emergency pickup at my old Upper West Side address. There are a few pieces of furniture left inside, but honestly, you can just donate them to charity. I only need the team to grab my safe and my backup hard drives. Bill the premium overnight fee directly to my corporate account, please." "Absolutely, Ms. Audrey," David replied smoothly. "Shall we deliver the items to your primary residence in Tribeca?" "Yes, the Tribeca loft," I confirmed. "Thank you, David." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. My father's arms fell to his sides. The stern, authoritative look on his face completely dissolved, replaced by total bewilderment. "Tribeca," he stammered. "What corporate account? What are you talking about, Audrey?" I picked up the two garbage bags, tossing them effortlessly over my shoulder. "Did you really think I was still living paycheck to paycheck, Dad? I bought a $3 million loft in Tribeca 14 months ago. I never told you or Mom about it because I knew the exact second you found out I had money, you would demand I use it to fund Bradley's ridiculous artificial intelligence startup." My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked down at the drill in his hand, suddenly realizing how pathetic his little eviction stunt actually was. "You can keep the apartment, Richard," I said, dropping the title of Dad for the first time in my life. "And keep the cheap furniture. You are going to need a place to live when your golden child burns through that $4 million and takes your retirement savings down with him. Good night to you." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Tribeca loft. I woke up feeling an incredible sense of peace. For the first time in my life, the heavy expectations of my parents were completely gone. I made myself a cappuccino and sat at my kitchen island opening Instagram. Even though my family had officially cut me out of their lives, I still had a burner account I used to monitor industry trends. I typed in Zoe's username and tapped on her glowing profile picture. She had been incredibly busy since leaving the restaurant last night. Her Instagram stories were a continuous feed of chaotic, aggressive spending. The first video showed Bradley signing a massive stack of papers in a sleek glass-walled boardroom. Zoe's voice shrieked from behind the camera, screaming that her husband was the new king of Soho. They had just signed a 5-year lease on a Class A commercial office space in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Manhattan. I knew from my own real estate experience that a lease like that required a massive upfront deposit, likely draining hundreds of thousands of dollars from the buyout money instantly. The next story was even more ridiculous. Zoe was sitting in the passenger seat of a brand new custom painted Miami blue Porsche. Bradley was revving the engine while Zoe filmed herself adjusting her Cartier necklace. The caption across the video read, "When God blesses you with a $4 million seed, round you have to treat yourself." She then turned the camera to her face, putting on her best fake sympathetic expression. She started speaking directly to her followers, launching into a passive-aggressive rant disguised as a motivational speech. Sometimes Zoe preached into the lens you have to cut off toxic, jealous family members to reach your true potential. There will always be people who try to hold you back because they do not have the vision to build an empire. You cannot let the haters drain your energy. Protect your peace and your capital. Family supports family, and if they do not, they are just dead weight. I watched the video twice, letting out a soft laugh. She was so convinced that she had won. They were blowing through the investor capital as if it was their personal lottery winnings, completely oblivious to the legal hurricane gathering just offshore. They honestly thought Trenton had handed them a blank check with absolutely no strings attached. I closed the app, finished my coffee, and went to take a shower. I had a real empire to run. An hour later, I stepped out of a private elevator and walked into my actual corporate office. It was a sprawling modern space filled with natural light, busy employees, and the quiet hum of productivity. My assistant greeted me, handed me my schedule for the day, and asked if I needed anything else. I told her to hold all my calls for the next 20 minutes. I walked into my private suite, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and sat down at my desk. I opened the biometric safe built into my credenza and pulled out a thick black leather binder. These were the actual legal documents of my business, the papers my parents and brother never bothered to read. When I was 22 years old, shortly after my mother secretly drained my savings account to pay off one of Bradley's early credit card debts, I realized I needed financial protection. I hired a brilliant corporate attorney. Together, we quietly incorporated a Delaware C Corp named Audrey's Vault Incorporated. I was the sole founder, the sole shareholder, and the absolute owner. Every single piece of intellectual property I ever created, every vector file, every trademark, and every lucrative licensing contract with companies like Target and Apple was legally owned by that C Corp. The LLC that my mother had co-signed, the one they just sold to Trenton for $4 million, was nothing but a hollow shell. It was an operational dummy company. Its only purpose was to hold the lease for my physical art studio and process payroll for a few freelance assistants. It owned absolutely zero intellectual property. They sold Trenton a completely empty box. I traced my finger over the raised gold seal on the Delaware Incorporation certificate, feeling the heavy weight of absolute certainty. My family thought they had pulled off the ultimate heist. They believed they had stripped me of my life's work and banished me to the streets. But as I sat in my multi-million-dollar office watching them broadcast their fraudulent spending spree to the entire world, I knew the countdown had already started. The trap was now set and waiting for them. 2 weeks later, the grand illusion finally reached its absolute peak. Bradley decided to host an extravagant launch party for his artificial intelligence startup at their new Soho office. He spared absolutely no expense, treating the $4 million like a bottomless wishing well. I saw the event plastered all over social media because my mother could not stop posting live updates. They had hired a celebrity DJ, installed a massive champagne tower, and catered the event with gourmet caviar and Wagyu sliders. The office space itself was heavily decorated with expensive modern art and custom neon signs displaying the company logo. Hundreds of guests filled the room, most of them random influencers and socialites who had absolutely no connection to the tech industry. They were just there for the free alcohol and the aesthetics. Bradley was walking around in a black turtleneck, desperately trying to channel the energy of a brilliant tech visionary. He was shaking hands, taking photos, and speaking loudly about disrupting the industry. He looked exactly like a man who was playing dress-up with someone else's credit card. In the corner of the room, Zoe was holding court with a reporter from a popular online tech blog. She was wearing a custom designer gown and the same Cartier diamond necklace she had bought with my money. The reporter was asking her about the challenges of building a startup from the ground up. Zoe leaned into the microphone, put on her most sincere expression, and began spinning a completely fabricated narrative of struggle and perseverance. "We face so many obstacles getting this company off the ground," Zoe told the camera, her voice dripping with artificial humility. "The hardest part was actually overcoming family sabotage. There were toxic people in our own inner circle who tried to steal our ideas and tear us down because they were jealous of our vision. But my husband and I refused to let that negativity stop us. We cut out the dead weight and focused on our destiny. Now we are standing here tonight fully funded and ready to change the world." My parents were standing right behind her in the video, nodding proudly in agreement. They were actively endorsing the public humiliation of their own daughter to protect their golden child. While my family was busy drinking champagne and performing for the cameras in a rented office, I was sitting in my own boardroom 30 blocks away. The room was completely silent, except for the voices coming through the speakers of my large conference monitor. I was on a private Zoom call with senior licensing executives from Target and Apple. They had no idea about the petty family drama unfolding downtown, and they did not care. They only cared about the intellectual property legally owned by Audrey's Vault Incorporated. For the past 6 months, my legal team and I had been quietly negotiating a massive expansion of my digital art portfolio. Target wanted to use my proprietary floral patterns for their upcoming spring home goods collection, and Apple was finalizing an exclusive contract to feature my animated wallpapers on their next generation of tablets. I was looking at the finalized digital contracts on my screen. The numbers staring back at me were staggering. These 2 deals alone were worth almost triple the amount my parents had sold my empty shell company for. The head of product design from Apple smiled through the screen. "Audrey, we are incredibly excited to move forward with this partnership," she said. "Your artistic vision is exactly what we need for the new launch. Our legal department has reviewed the corporate ownership documents for Audrey's Vault Incorporated and everything looks perfect. The intellectual property is fully secured under your name. Are you ready to make this official?" I smiled back, feeling a profound sense of validation. I picked up my electronic stylus and signed my name on the digital screen, authorizing the massive multi-million-dollar contracts. "I am thrilled to partner with you," I replied. "Let us get to work on this amazing project together." As the call ended, I leaned back in my comfortable leather chair and looked out the large glass window at the glittering New York skyline. The beautiful city lights sparkled brilliantly against the dark evening sky. I had just safely secured my financial future for the rest of my life through actual hard work, relentless dedication, and ironclad legal protection. Meanwhile, Bradley and Zoe were blowing through a finite pool of stolen investor cash to celebrate a product that did not even exist. They had built a massive house of cards, and they were throwing a very loud, expensive party on the roof. They had absolutely no clue that a massive legal wind was about to blow everything away forever. The massive legal wind began to blow exactly 48 hours after their lavish launch party. It started inside a quiet, brightly lit server room on the 50th floor of a commercial building in the financial district. Trenton's lead information technology director, a brilliant guy named Kevin, was working the graveyard shift to handle the server migration for the newly acquired company. Trenton had instructed his tech team to pull all the digital assets, vector graphics licensing contracts, and proprietary source files from my old servers and integrate them into their main corporate network. Kevin sat at his multi-monitor setup with a massive cup of coffee, preparing to transfer what he assumed would be terabytes of high-resolution design files. He entered the administrative credentials that my mother had so proudly handed over at the restaurant. The system authenticated the password, and Kevin gained full access to the back end of the limited liability company. He opened the main directory and blinked. He rubbed his eyes and refreshed the screen. The entire server contained less than 50 megabytes of total data. Thinking there was a routing error, Kevin dug deeper into the file structure. He clicked on a folder labeled Legal Documents, expecting to find my lucrative licensing agreements with major national brands. Instead, he found a scanned copy of my original 2014 studio lease, a few renewal addendums, and an old contract for a commercial dumpster service. He clicked on another folder labeled Payroll. It contained tax forms for a part-time receptionist I hired 6 years ago and a few invoices for a weekend cleaning crew. There were no vector files. There were no graphic design portfolios. There were absolutely no corporate intellectual property contracts. Kevin ran a complete diagnostic sweep of the entire network architecture. The results came back perfectly clean and completely empty. Trenton had not purchased a digital art empire. He had purchased a digital ghost town. Kevin immediately picked up his phone and called his boss. It was almost 2 in the morning, but when you are dealing with a $4 million acquisition, you do not wait until normal business hours to report a total catastrophe. Trenton was asleep in his penthouse when his phone began to ring. He answered with a groggy, irritated tone, demanding to know why his lead tech director was calling him in the middle of the night. Kevin did not sugarcoat the situation. He bluntly explained that the servers they just acquired were completely hollow. "What do you mean they are hollow?" Trenton barked, suddenly wide awake and sitting up in his bed. "Did the files get corrupted during the transfer process? Did she delete everything before we took over? Get our cybersecurity team on this immediately to recover the data." Kevin sighed into the receiver. "The data was never deleted, sir. The data was never there to begin with. I checked the server history. This specific domain has never hosted high-resolution graphics or enterprise-level contracts. It is just an administrative shell. It looks like a dummy company used exclusively for handling physical overhead costs. There is zero intellectual property attached to this entity. You bought an empty box." A cold, terrifying realization washed over Trenton. He remembered my parting words at the restaurant. I had warned him to have his corporate lawyers read the fine print. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance and my mother's aggressive sales pitch that he authorized the wire transfer based on a superficial summary. Trenton ended the call with Kevin. His face was flushed with absolute rage. He opened his contacts and hit the dial button for Bradley. Across town, Bradley and Zoe were sound asleep in their expensive luxury apartment, exhausted from a long day of pretending to be tech executives. When Bradley's phone vibrated aggressively on the nightstand, he groaned and swiped the screen to answer. "Hello," Bradley mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Where are the source files?" Trenton screamed through the speaker, his voice so loud that Zoe woke up instantly. "Where is the intellectual property, you little fraud?" Bradley sat up, clutching the phone tightly. "What are you talking about, Trenton? What source files? The tech team was supposed to migrate everything tonight." "There is nothing to migrate," Trenton roared. "Your mother sold me a worthless shell company. Your sister completely played you. I want the administrative passwords to the actual digital vault right now, or I promise you will spend the next 10 years of your pathetic life rotting inside a federal prison cell for committing massive wire fraud against my investment firm. Do you understand me now, boy? I expect you to have those correct passwords delivered directly to my private office tomorrow morning without fail." The line went dead. Bradley sat in his bed, the phone slipping from his trembling hand. He did not know anything about server migrations or intellectual property. He only knew how to spend money. In sheer panic, he immediately dialed our mother. My phone started ringing at exactly 6:15 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting in my kitchen with a fresh cup of espresso, watching the sunrise over the city. When I saw my mother's name flashing on the screen, I smiled, set down my cup, and swiped to answer. I did not say hello. I just let the silence hang there, forcing her to speak first. "Audrey, My mother said, her voice tight and breathless, clearly trying to mask her rising panic with her usual condescending tone. I am so glad you are awake. We need to talk about this little stunt you are pulling. I am not pulling any stunts, Mom, I replied calmly. I am just enjoying my morning coffee. What can I do for you? She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shifting instantly into the toxic therapy speak she always used when she wanted to manipulate a situation. Audrey, we need to heal this rupture in our relationship. I know you are feeling marginalized, and I validate your feelings of inadequacy regarding your brother's success. But holding the company data hostage is a trauma response. You are acting out because you feel unseen. We are a family, Audrey. We need to move past this toxicity. Stop acting out and give Trenton the admin passwords to the IP vault right now so we can finalize the transition. I took a slow sip of my espresso, savoring the bitter, rich flavor. It was fascinating to hear her weaponize psychological buzzwords to justify stealing my life. There is no data being held hostage, Mom, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The server passwords you gave Trenton are entirely accurate for the company he purchased. He has full access to the limited liability company. Then why is he threatening to send your brother to federal prison? She practically screamed, dropping the calm therapist act completely. He says the servers are completely empty. He says there are no design files and no licensing contracts. Where did you hide the intellectual property, Audrey? Stop playing these childish games and give us the administrative passwords immediately. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the morning sky. I did not hide anything, Mom, I stated. Trenton bought exactly what you sold him. You sold him 51% of an administrative payroll shell. What are you talking about? She snapped. I co-signed for your design business. I own the majority of it. The lawyer said we had every right to sell the assets. You co-signed for a dummy company I used to pay the rent for a physical studio and process checks for a cleaning crew, I explained slowly, as if speaking to a toddler. When I was 22 years old, right after you drained my personal savings to pay off one of Bradley's credit cards, I realized I could never trust you. So I hired a corporate attorney. I founded a Delaware C Corp called Audrey's Vault Incorporated. I am the sole founder, and I own 100% of the shares. That corporation owns every single piece of intellectual property I have ever created. It owns the vector files. It owns the copyrights. It holds the multi-million-dollar licensing contracts with Apple and Target. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head as the catastrophic reality of her situation finally set in. The LLC you sold to Trenton does not own my art, Mom. I continued, my voice turning to ice. It never did. You sold him a hollow box with a few old lease agreements inside. The passwords to the intellectual property vault belong to a private corporation that you have absolutely zero legal connection to. You and Bradley committed wire fraud. You took $4 million from a ruthless venture capitalist for an asset you did not own. Audrey, please. My mother gasped, her voice suddenly small and trembling. You have to fix this. You have to transfer the rights to the LLC. If you do not, Trenton is going to destroy your brother. He will take everything from us. I stood up and walked over to the large glass window looking down at the busy New York streets below. You made a strategic financial decision, Mom. Remember, just business, nothing personal. I suggest you tell your golden child to call his lawyer. I simply ended the call and permanently blocked her personal cellular phone number. Less than an hour after I hung up the phone, my entire family was standing in the immaculate glass lobby of Trenton's investment firm in the financial district. My mother had immediately called my father and brother in hysterics, forcing them to drop everything. Zoe had tagged along, her face pale, frantically clutching her expensive designer purse. A stern security guard escorted them into a massive private elevator. The ride up to the 50th floor was completely silent, heavy with the suffocating weight of impending doom. When the elevator doors finally opened, Trenton's executive assistant did not offer them coffee or water. She simply pointed toward the large double doors of the main boardroom. They walked inside slowly, taking their seats at the long mahogany table. For 20 agonizing minutes, they sat there alone, sweating in their expensive new clothes, waiting for the executioner to arrive. The heavy boardroom doors suddenly swung open. Trenton marched into the room, his face a mask of absolute fury. He was followed by his lead corporate attorney and Kevin, the information technology director. Trenton did not greet them. He did not sit down. He walked directly over to where my brother was sitting, raised a thick stack of legal documents, and slammed them violently onto the table right in front of Bradley's face. The loud crack echoed through the massive room, causing Zoe to physically jump in her seat. My parents shrank back, their arrogant confidence completely shattered. Bradley stared at the thick binder, his hands trembling slightly, as he looked up at the enraged billionaire. "Are you enjoying the new Porsche?" Bradley Trenton asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Are you enjoying the Class A office space in Soho that you leased with my money? I certainly hope you are. Because those are the last luxury items you will ever see outside of a federal prison cell." My father tried to intervene, standing up defensively. "Now listen here, Trenton. There is a misunderstanding. My wife had the legal right to sell that company." Trenton turned his blazing eyes onto my father. "Sit down and shut your mouth, Richard," he barked. "You sold me 51% of an administrative shell. Do you know what my tech team found on those servers last night? Nothing. Do you know what physical assets I legally acquired for $4 million? A handful of 5-year-old drafting tables, some expired printer ink, and a broken espresso machine. You sold me a garbage disposal disguised as a tech acquisition." My mother started sobbing softly, pressing a tissue to her face. "We did not know, Trenton," she cried, using her best victim voice. "Audrey handled all the legal paperwork for her business. She tricked us. She must have hidden the intellectual property maliciously." Trenton laughed, but it was a cold, terrifying sound. "She did not trick anyone, Diane. My lawyers pulled the public records from Delaware this morning. Audrey's Vault Incorporated has existed for over 10 years. It is a completely separate corporation. Your daughter did not hide anything. She just let you sell something you never actually owned. You committed massive financial fraud. You took $4 million of my capital under false pretenses. That is federal wire fraud. It is a felony. And every single one of you is going to prison." Zoe let out a loud gasp, grabbing Bradley's arm. "Bradley, do something," she hissed. "Tell him we did not know. We cannot go to jail. I am the chief marketing officer. I just started." Trenton leaned over the table, getting right in Zoe's face. "You are the chief marketing officer of absolutely nothing," he sneered. "You are spending stolen funds. Every diamond on your neck was bought with defrauded money. The federal government is going to seize every asset you have touched in the last 48 hours. Trenton straightened his custom suit jacket and delivered his final ultimatum. "I do not care about your petty family drama. I do not care how much you hate your sister. I only care about my investment. You have exactly 24 hours to get Audrey to sign over the intellectual property from her Delaware corporation to my firm. If those vector files and lucrative licensing contracts are not legally transferred to my servers by tomorrow morning, I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I will personally ensure the prosecutors seek the maximum penalty for every single one of you. Get out of my office and fix this immediately, or pack your bags for federal prison. Do you understand me?" Bradley nodded slowly, unable to speak as the terrifying reality of his situation finally set in. They all stood up silently and quickly fled the luxurious glass boardroom in absolute panic and total, deeply humiliating public disgrace. The following morning, I was sitting at my favorite high-end coffee shop in Tribeca, enjoying a quiet moment before heading into the office. The sunlight caught the steam rising from my matcha latte as I sketched a new floral concept on my digital tablet. The tranquil atmosphere of the cafe was abruptly shattered when the heavy glass door was violently pushed open. Bradley and Zoe stormed inside, both looking frantic, disheveled, and completely stripped of their usual arrogant polish. Zoe's hair was messy, and Bradley was wearing the exact same clothes from his disastrous meeting with Trenton the day before. They scanned the crowded room, locked eyes with me, and marched directly toward my small corner table. Before I could even speak, Bradley slammed a crumpled stack of legal papers right on top of my tablet. He leaned over the small round table, bracing both of his hands on the edge, deliberately trying to use his physical size to tower over me and block me into the corner booth. "Sign this right now, Audrey," he demanded, his voice shaking with a desperate, aggressive edge. "It is a retroactive intellectual property transfer agreement. It legally moves all the assets from your private corporation into the limited liability company Mom sold to Trenton. If you sign it right now and backdate it to last week, the venture capital firm will drop the wire fraud charges against us, and we can all just walk away from this mess." I looked down at the messy paperwork, then back up at my brother's panicked, sweating face. "I am not signing anything, Bradley," I replied calmly, leaning back in my chair to create physical distance between us. "You and Mom committed fraud. That is your problem to solve, not mine." Zoe suddenly slammed her designer purse onto the table next to the papers, causing my coffee cup to rattle loudly. "Do not play games with us, Audrey," she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply across the quiet cafe. Everyone in the coffee shop stopped talking and turned to stare at us. "You are a thief. You maliciously hid those digital assets from your own family to sabotage my husband's career. You stole our $4 million valuation, and you are trying to ruin our lives." I did not raise my voice, nor did I break eye contact with my frantic sister-in-law. Instead, I smoothly reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, opened the camera application, and hit the record button. I held the phone up, making sure both of their faces were clearly visible on the screen. "Let the record show that it is currently 9 in the morning," I said, clearly ensuring the microphone picked up every word. "My brother Bradley and his wife Zoe have just ambushed me in a public place, attempting to physically intimidate me into signing a fraudulent legal document." "Put the phone away," Audrey Bradley hissed, reaching across the table to grab my wrist. I quickly pulled my hand back and leveled a cold glare at him. "Touch me again, Bradley, and I will add assault to the list of federal charges you are already facing," I warned. "You came here demanding I surrender my intellectual property to save you from your own stupidity. So let us clarify the corporate structures for the camera, shall we? You and Mom sold 51% of an administrative shell company that never owned any art. You took $4 million from an investor without conducting a single day of due diligence. My Delaware corporation was established over a decade ago. It is a completely separate legal entity. I am not a thief, Zoe. I am just a competent business owner who legally protected her assets from a family of opportunistic parasites." Zoe stepped back, her face turning a deep shade of crimson as she realized dozens of customers were watching and recording the meltdown on their own phones. "You are pure evil," Zoe spat, though her voice lacked its previous volume. "You are going to let your own blood rot in a federal jail over some stupid computer drawings." I kept recording as I slowly stood up from the table. "Those stupid computer drawings are worth tens of millions of dollars, Zoe, and they belong exclusively to me." I picked up my tablet and my purse, stepping around my frozen brother. "I suggest you take that fake retroactive contract and use it to hire a very good criminal defense attorney. You are going to need one." I walked out of the crowded coffee shop, leaving them both standing there in absolute humiliating public disgrace. Their house of cards was finally collapsing, and I felt nothing but pure peace as I stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. I arrived at my corporate office feeling an exhilarating rush of pure adrenaline after my morning coffee. The morning sunlight flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my boardroom as I took my seat at the head of the table. Waiting for me was my lead corporate attorney, Mr. Caldwell. He was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and prestigious law firms in Manhattan, a man who specialized in intellectual property and corporate warfare. I did not waste any time. I placed my smartphone on the polished mahogany table and played the video of the coffee shop ambush. Caldwell watched the footage with absolute focus, his sharp eyes tracking every aggressive movement my brother made, and every threatening word that left Zoe's mouth. When the video ended, Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. "This is textbook harassment and attempted coercion," he stated, his voice calm but laced with a dangerous edge. "They are desperate, Audrey. They know the venture capital firm is preparing to press federal charges, and they are trying to use familial intimidation to force you into saving them. We are going to legally shut this down immediately to protect your multi-million-dollar intellectual property. No more surprise visits, no more physical intimidation. I am drafting a formal cease and desist order right now. Within 2 hours, the legal documents were finalized, signed, and dispatched via private process servers. I wanted my family to understand exactly who they were dealing with. I was no longer the quiet little girl who would shrink away in fear when my parents raised their voices. I was a CEO with a multi-million-dollar enterprise and a legal team that could bury them in paperwork for the next decade. Across town at my parents' suburban home, the delivery was swift and jarring. My mother, Diane, was standing in her kitchen, frantically pacing the hardwood floor and anxiously waiting for my brother to call with good news about the retroactively dated contract. When the doorbell rang, she rushed to answer it, likely expecting a package delivery. Instead, a man in a sharp gray suit handed her a thick manila envelope and simply said, "You have been served." Diane ripped open the envelope, her eyes scanning the heavy legal letterhead of Caldwell's elite Manhattan firm. As she read the formal cease and desist order, the remaining color drained completely from her face. The document outlined a strict prohibition against any physical or digital contact with me, my employees, or my business associates. It explicitly referenced the coffee shop ambush and warned that any further attempts at harassment or corporate espionage would result in an immediate civil lawsuit and a request for a permanent restraining order. My father, Richard, walked into the hallway asking who was at the door. Diane just handed him the paper, her hands shaking violently. For the first time in her life, she realized she could not manipulate her way out of the situation. Her daughter was completely untouchable. Simultaneously, a second process server arrived at the newly leased Class A office space in Soho. Bradley and Zoe were standing near the reception desk, loudly arguing with a vendor who was demanding a deposit for their upcoming office furniture delivery. The glass doors swung open and the process server walked straight up to Bradley, ignoring the vendor entirely. "Are you Bradley?" the server asked. Bradley nodded, clearly confused. The server handed him the identical thick legal envelope. Zoe quickly snatched it out of her husband's hands and tore it open. As she read the aggressive legal jargon, she let out a sharp gasp. The few employees they had managed to hire were all staring at them, witnessing the supposed tech visionary and his chief marketing officer being served with legal papers for harassing a family member. The cease and desist order was a massive psychological blow. Up until this exact moment, my family still believed they held some sort of inherent authority over me. They genuinely thought that if they just applied enough pressure, screamed loud enough, or caused a big enough public scene, I would eventually cave and hand over my intellectual property to save them. That was the dynamic they had relied on for 33 years. But staring at the expensive legal letterhead bearing my name, that deeply ingrained illusion shattered completely. They were not dealing with a defenseless scapegoat anymore. They were staring down the barrel of a massive corporate legal defense that they could not afford to fight. By the end of the day, the power dynamic had completely inverted. My family was entirely isolated. They were legally barred from contacting me, while the angry billionaire investor prepared his final destructive blow against their failing startup. That final destructive blow arrived faster than any of them could have anticipated. While my corporate lawyer was busy building an impenetrable legal fortress around my intellectual property, Trenton's legal team was executing a synchronized financial strike. They did not wait for the 24-hour deadline to expire. Realizing that Bradley and Zoe were hemorrhaging the $4 million investment on luxury cars and expensive office furniture, Trenton's attorneys filed an emergency ex parte motion in federal court. A judge reviewed the overwhelming evidence of corporate fraud and immediately granted an injunction. Within hours of being served my cease and desist order, every single bank account associated with my parents' limited liability company and Bradley's artificial intelligence startup was completely frozen. The corporate credit cards, the personal checking accounts linked to the fraudulent transfer, Even Zoe's premium shopping accounts were all simultaneously locked down. The financial guillotine had dropped, but Bradley and Zoe were completely unaware. That evening, operating under a potent mixture of denial and sheer delusion, my brother decided the best way to handle the crisis was to pretend it did not exist. He and Zoe hosted a lavish dinner at an exclusive Manhattan steakhouse to impress three potential tech developers he was trying to poach from a rival firm. They ordered 4 bottles of vintage Cabernet massive dry-aged tomahawk steaks and towers of fresh seafood. Bradley spent the entire 2-hour dinner loudly bragging about his $4 million seed round and his visionary leadership. Zoe sat beside him, her Cartier necklace glittering in the dim restaurant lighting, playing the role of the successful tech wife. She ordered expensive desserts and imported espresso for the table, acting as though they were completely invincible. They were performing their favorite play entirely oblivious to the fact that the stage was actively collapsing beneath their feet. When the extravagant meal finally concluded, the waiter brought over a leather folder containing a bill that easily exceeded $3,000. Bradley did not even glance at the itemized receipt. He confidently pulled his heavy metal corporate credit card from his designer wallet and dropped it onto the small silver tray with a practiced flick of his wrist. The waiter gave a polite nod and walked away to process the payment. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned looking incredibly uncomfortable. He leaned down and quietly informed my brother that the transaction had been declined. Bradley let out an arrogant laugh, assuring his confused guests that it was simply a daily spending limit security trigger. He pulled out his personal platinum card and handed it over, instructing the waiter to run it again. Another 5 minutes passed. The waiter returned a second time, his polite smile now replaced with a rigid expression of professional concern. That card had also been declined. The three potential tech developers exchanged nervous glances across the table. Bradley felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He aggressively patted his pockets, his facade of immense wealth rapidly crumbling in real time. Zoe let out an exasperated sigh, dramatically rolling her eyes at her husband. "Honestly, Bradley, you need to have your assistant fix these banking alerts," she scolded loudly, making sure the guests heard her. She reached into her purse and produced a sleek black credit card. "Just put it on my account," she told the waiter, waving him away dismissively. When the waiter returned for the third time and informed Zoe that her card was also rejected, the illusion completely shattered. Zoe immediately escalated the situation, jumping out of her seat and throwing a massive tantrum right in the middle of the crowded dining room. She began screaming at the waiter, accusing the restaurant of having faulty credit card machines and threatening to destroy their reputation on social media. She yelled that she was the chief marketing officer of a multi-million-dollar tech firm and demanded to speak to the general manager immediately. The manager arrived promptly, holding a printed slip of paper from the terminal. He calmly explained that their machines were working perfectly. The error code on the receipt was not for insufficient funds or a security hold. The code specifically indicated that the accounts had been frozen by a federal banking institution. Zoe's screaming abruptly stopped. The color drained from her face as she looked over at Bradley, who was now staring blankly at the table, completely paralyzed by fear. The three tech developers quietly stood up, grabbed their coats, and walked out of the restaurant without saying a single word to them. Zoe and Bradley were left standing alone in the center of the upscale steakhouse, utterly humiliated and completely unable to pay for their extravagant meal, finally realizing that Trenton had completely locked them out of their stolen empire. The news of the humiliation at the steakhouse reached my parents late that evening. Bradley called them in tears from a yellow cab, explaining that their luxury vehicles were impounded and their corporate bank accounts were completely frozen by federal order. The panic simmering in my parents' suburban home finally boiled over into absolute desperation. My father Richard decided he had tolerated enough of my rebellious insubordination. He completely ignored the legal cease and desist order served to him just hours earlier. In his mind, legal documents did not apply to his patriarchal authority. He believed that if he just stood in front of me and raised his voice, I would revert to being the obedient little girl he had controlled for 33 years. The next morning, I was sitting on the velvet sofa in my Tribeca loft, reviewing a new contract on my tablet. Suddenly, a heavy pounding echoed from my front door. I checked the security camera feed and saw my father standing in the hallway. His face was red with anger, and he was glaring directly into the camera lens. He had managed to slip past the front lobby desk by following a delivery worker through the secure glass doors. I set my tablet down, took a deep, calming breath, and walked over to the entryway. I did not feel the familiar knot of anxiety that usually formed in my stomach whenever he was angry. I just felt profoundly exhausted by his relentless arrogance. I unlatched the heavy deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open, leaving the chain securely attached. "Open this door right now, Audrey," my father demanded, his voice echoing loudly down the quiet upscale hallway. "I am not playing these childish legal games with you anymore. You are going to sign the intellectual property transfer papers today. You are going to fix this mess you created, and you are going to apologize to your brother. I am your father, and I command you to stop this ridiculous tantrum immediately." He pushed his large hand against the heavy wooden door, expecting me to immediately unhook the chain and step aside out of sheer conditioned fear. He expected me to lower my eyes and submit to his demands, just to avoid a public scene. Instead, I stood my ground, looking directly into his angry eyes. I did not flinch, and I did not reach for the chain. "You are violating a formal legal order," Richard, I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and completely devoid of emotion. "If you do not leave this hallway right now, I am going to call the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing and harassment." My father let out a harsh, condescending laugh. "You are not going to arrest your own father," he sneered, pointing a thick finger at my face through the narrow opening. "You think because you hired a fancy Manhattan lawyer and rented a nice apartment that you are suddenly untouchable. I co-signed your first lease. I put a roof over your head. You owe this family everything. You are going to let me inside, and we are going to drive to Trenton's office together to sign those files over." I looked at him with genuine pity. He was clinging so desperately to a version of reality that no longer existed. "Richard," I said quietly, leaning slightly toward the gap in the doorway, "you still do not understand the scale of what is happening here. You think I just rented a nice apartment to hide from you? I bought this $3 million loft 14 months ago with cash. In fact, I loved the location so much that my corporate holding company went ahead and purchased this entire residential building last week. You did not just break into my apartment building, you trespassed on my private real estate." The arrogant sneer completely vanished from his face. His hand slowly slipped off the wooden door as the staggering weight of my financial reality finally crushed his patriarchal delusions. Before he could formulate a response, the elevator down the hall chimed. Two burly men in sharp black suits stepped out. They were my private building security team, whom I had silently paged the moment I saw him on the camera. My father looked at the approaching guards, then back at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound defeat. "Escort this man off my property," I told the guards firmly. "If he ever returns, call the authorities and press full charges." As the security team firmly grabbed his arms and led him away, I closed the door, listening to the solid click of the lock. The psychological chains he had wrapped around me for 33 years shattered completely, leaving me entirely free. As the security guards escorted my father out of my building, I watched his defeated posture through the camera monitor. The absolute destruction of his patriarchal ego was finally complete. He stumbled slightly as the heavy glass doors closed behind him. But desperation makes people incredibly stupid. Instead of accepting their fate and cooperating with federal investigators to minimize their prison sentences, my family decided to double down. With all of their corporate bank accounts and premium credit cards completely frozen by the federal judge, they had absolutely zero access to the $4 million. Bradley and Zoe were completely broke. My parents had to quickly liquidate whatever personal assets they still had available. My mother frantically drained her emergency savings account, and my father emptied his remaining retirement funds, absorbing massive tax penalties. Zoe even had to secretly pawn her prized Cartier diamond necklace just to keep her leased Porsche from being repossessed immediately. They pooled every single dollar they had left to fund one final desperate attack against me. They needed aggressive legal representation, but since they were completely cut off from major financial institutions, no reputable law firm in Manhattan would take their calls. Elite lawyers require massive retainers and run comprehensive background checks. Instead, they scoured the internet and found a sleazy low-rent attorney named Donovan, who ran his questionable practice out of a rundown strip mall in New Jersey. Donovan was the exact type of lawyer who advertised heavily on late-night television, specializing in frivolous litigation and quick cash settlements. When my terrified parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law piled into his cramped, dimly lit office, Donovan took one look at their desperate faces and the thick stack of physical cash they dropped onto his scratched laminate desk. He eagerly agreed to take their case without conducting a single hour of due diligence. He smoothly filled their heads with absolute nonsense, confidently promising them that he could easily pierce my corporate veil and legally force me to hand over my multi-million-dollar portfolio. Donovan quickly drafted a remarkably sloppy and entirely frivolous civil lawsuit against me. The primary charge was an absurdly fabricated allegation of breach of fiduciary duty. His ridiculous legal theory claimed that because I was previously the listed manager of the limited liability company my parents had sold to Trenton, I somehow had a binding legal obligation to surrender all my independent intellectual property to that specific shell company. He aggressively accused me of fraudulent concealment of assets, arguing that my Delaware corporation was just an illegal tax shelter explicitly designed to rob my family. It was a massive legal stretch, built entirely on desperate lies and a complete misunderstanding of modern corporate law. But for my family, this ridiculous lawsuit was their absolute last hope. They genuinely believed that the sheer threat of dragging me into a messy public courtroom would terrify me into immediate submission. They thought I would quickly surrender my digital empire just to avoid the public embarrassment of litigation. 2 days later, I was sitting at a corner table in my favorite upscale bistro, enjoying a quiet lunch and reviewing digital proofs for the upcoming Target home goods launch. A nervous-looking man in a wrinkled windbreaker rapidly approached my table. "Are you Audrey?" he asked loudly, holding a thick manila envelope. I smiled politely, took another bite of my salad, and nodded. "You have been served?" he mumbled, hastily dropping the heavy envelope onto the table before practically running out of the busy restaurant. I calmly wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, picked up the envelope, and pulled out the legal documents. The header displayed Donovan's cheap, pixelated law firm logo, and the title of the document screamed about breach of fiduciary duty and malicious fraud. I began reading through the lawsuit, scanning the ridiculous allegations and the wildly aggressive demands for immediate asset forfeiture. When I reached the final paragraph where Donovan boldly demanded I transfer my Delaware shares to Bradley as compensation for severe emotional distress, I could not hold it back anymore. I literally laughed out loud, the sound echoing clearly across the restaurant and drawing curious glances from the neighboring tables. The sheer audacity was absolutely hilarious. They had spent their absolute last dime to throw a paper airplane at a titanium fortress. I pulled out my phone, took a quick photo of the ridiculous subpoena, and opened my text messages. I sent the picture directly to my corporate attorney. My message was brief and to the point. They took the bait I typed. "Call this strip mall lawyer and tell him we are incredibly intimidated. Set up an official mediation meeting for this Friday at Trenton's office. Let us finish this once and for all." It was Thursday evening, the night before the official mediation meeting with Trenton and my family. My corporate holding company had just acquired a stunning multi-level gallery space in Chelsea, and I was hosting a private VIP exhibition to celebrate the upcoming launch of my new digital art collections. The room was filled with New York's elite art collectors, corporate executives from Apple and Target, and high-profile investors. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated with trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Soft classical music played over the state-of-the-art sound system as my digital floral patterns shifted and bloomed across the massive high-definition projection walls. It was the absolute pinnacle of my career, a perfect evening of professional triumph. But desperate people have a terrifying habit of ruining beautiful things. Right as I was raising my crystal glass to propose a toast to my senior design team, the heavy glass doors of the gallery were violently shoved open. Zoe marched into the elegant room, completely ignoring the stunned hostess who desperately tried to stop her. She looked absolutely unhinged. Her designer clothes were heavily wrinkled, her hair was a mess, and the Cartier diamond necklace was noticeably absent from her neck, likely sitting in a pawn shop display case. The quiet murmur of sophisticated conversation instantly died down as Zoe stomped past the wealthy patrons. Her eyes locked furiously on me. She reached the center of the gallery floor, spun around to face the crowd of influential buyers, and began screaming at the top of her lungs. "Do not do business with this woman!" Zoe shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger directly at my face. "She is a criminal and a massive fraud. She stole $4 million from my husband's technology startup. She maliciously hid her corporate assets to bankrupt her own family and leave us with absolutely nothing. She is a thief and a liar." Gasps rippled through the elegant crowd. A few of the corporate executives exchanged nervous, confused glances. Zoe stood there, chest heaving, wearing a twisted smile of desperate triumph. She genuinely believed that this loud public ambush would finally break me. She thought I would be so terrified of losing these high-profile clients that I would immediately drag her into a back room and sign away my intellectual property just to make her stop screaming. But I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or rush to defend myself. I simply looked at her with an expression of profound boredom. I turned to my gallery manager, a highly efficient woman named Claire, who was standing near the audio-visual control podium. "Claire," I said calmly, my voice projecting clearly across the completely silent room. "Could you please switch the main projectors to input 2 for a moment?" Claire gave a sharp nod and tapped a few buttons on her glowing tablet. The beautiful shifting floral patterns on the massive gallery walls instantly vanished. In their place, towering 30 feet high and illuminated in brilliant high definition, were the official legal documents of my Delaware corporation. The massive screens displayed the original articles of incorporation for Audrey's Vault Incorporated, clearly dated over a decade ago. It showed my name as the sole founder and 100% shareholder. Beside it, the screens displayed the fraudulent limited liability company contract my mother had sold to Trenton, explicitly highlighting the complete lack of intellectual property clauses. The stark contrast between the two legal realities was completely impossible to misunderstand. I turned back to my frantic sister-in-law, who was now staring up at the glowing walls with an expression of absolute suffocating horror. "The truth is literally written on the wall, Zoe," I said smoothly. "You and my brother sold an empty box to a venture capitalist because you were too arrogant and too lazy to read the fine print. You stole your own money." I gestured to the two large security guards who were already walking rapidly toward her. "Have a wonderful evening," I added, gently raising my champagne glass to her. The crowd watched in absolute silence as the guards firmly grabbed Zoe's arms and physically dragged her out of the gallery. She did not scream or fight back. She just let her head hang down in total crushing defeat, her pathetic public spectacle completely destroyed by the cold reality of corporate law. As the heavy glass doors swung shut behind her, the tension in the room instantly evaporated. The Apple executive standing nearest to me simply chuckled, raised his glass in my direction, and took a sip of his champagne. I smiled back, signaled Claire to restore the digital art, and smoothly resumed my speech to the highly impressed group of sophisticated guests. The morning after the gallery incident, a heavy rain washed over the city, reflecting the cold corporate reality waiting for us. At exactly 9, my lead attorney, Mr. Caldwell, and I stepped out of a private car in front of Trenton's towering financial district headquarters. We bypassed security and were escorted directly to the 50th floor via a private elevator. The environment was intensely intimidating. We walked down a long corridor lined with dark mahogany until we reached the main mediation room. It was a massive space encased entirely in soundproof glass. The sweeping views of the gray Manhattan skyline provided a fittingly dramatic backdrop for the corporate execution about to take place. Trenton was already seated at the far end of the conference table. He was flanked by three high-powered litigators who looked less like lawyers and more like predatory sharks smelling blood. Trenton did not look up when we entered. He stared at the thick stack of financial audits, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. He absolutely hated losing money, and he was currently out $4 million due to their incompetence. Caldwell and I took our seats calmly organizing our pristine leather binders. 15 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open. My family walked in, moving as a tight defensive pack. My father Richard led the way, aggressively puffing out his chest to project maximum authority. My mother Diane followed, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Bradley looked pale and exhausted, dark circles revealing the sleepless nights he endured since the federal bank freeze. Zoe walked in last, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. The public humiliation she suffered at my gallery had clearly drained her fight, but she still managed to feign arrogant defiance when sitting next to her husband. Leading their pathetic parade was Donovan, the cheap strip mall lawyer hired with their last remaining dollars. He looked completely out of place in the luxurious boardroom. His gray suit was poorly tailored, and his battered canvas briefcase loudly announced his lack of professional success. Despite the overwhelming intimidation of the room, my family actually looked bizarrely smug as they settled into the chairs across from me. They whispered excitedly among themselves, occasionally shooting me incredibly triumphant glares across the polished table. It was obvious Donovan spent the car ride filling their heads with legal fantasies, convincing them his frivolous lawsuit was an unstoppable weapon. A suffocating silence filled the glass room. Trenton finally looked up from his papers, his cold eyes sweeping over my family with absolute disgust. "Let us get this over with right now." Trenton snapped his patience, completely exhausted by their presence. "I am not here to listen to petty family grievances. I am here to recover my stolen assets. Either the intellectual property is legally transferred today, or my team files wire fraud charges with the federal prosecutor at exactly noon." Donovan cleared his throat, stood up and slammed his hands down on the mahogany table. He attempted to mimic posturing he had seen on television legal dramas. "My clients are the actual victims here," Donovan declared loudly, his voice echoing awkwardly. "We filed a formal civil lawsuit against Audrey for severe breach of fiduciary duty and malicious financial concealment. As the former manager of the limited liability company sold to this venture capital firm, she had a binding legal obligation to include all relevant digital assets in the transaction. By hiding her intellectual property inside a separate Delaware corporation, she defrauded both my clients and your investment firm." Donovan reached into his battered briefcase and pulled out a stack of hastily stapled papers, tossing them onto the center of the table with a dramatic flourish. "We are not intimidated by federal threats," Donovan continued, his chest puffed out with unearned confidence. "The solution to this dispute is incredibly simple. We demand that Audrey immediately sign a total asset forfeiture agreement. She must legally dissolve her Delaware corporation and transfer 100% of her copyrights, vector files, and licensing contracts directly into her brother's startup. If she surrenders the intellectual property right now, my clients will graciously drop their civil lawsuit against her, and Mr. Trenton will receive the assets he originally paid for. Everyone walks away happy, and this entire misunderstanding is permanently resolved." My mother leaned forward, looking at me with a sickeningly sweet smile of anticipated victory. Bradley sat up straighter, his arrogant smirk returning to his face as he waited for me to finally break. Caldwell slowly closed his leather binder, turned to me, and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap they had built for themselves was now perfectly set, and I was ready to spring it on them in front of everyone. Before Donovan could even finish distributing his completely worthless legal packets across the table, my mother decided it was time for her to deliver the emotional performance of her lifetime. Diane pushed her chair back, stood up slowly, and pressed a perfectly manicured hand against her chest. She took a deep, shaky breath, summoning tears that she had likely practiced in the mirror all morning. She looked directly at Trenton, ignoring me at first, attempting to play the role of the heartbroken matriarch trying to keep her family together. "Mr. Trenton, please forgive the legal formalities." Diane began, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "We are not corporate sharks. We are just a family who has been terribly betrayed by one of our own." She finally turned her gaze toward me, her eyes brimming with fake tears. "Audrey, look at what you are doing to your own flesh and blood. I built you from the ground up. When you were just a little girl drawing on the kitchen table, I was the one who bought your first set of paints and co-signed the lease for your very first studio when nobody else believed in your little hobby. I sacrificed my own comfort to give you a foundation. Everything you have was born from the support this family provided. We gave you the tools to succeed, and you repaid us by maliciously hiding your assets. You set up that secret corporation to rob your brother of his rightful share." Diane paused to wipe a single calculated tear from her cheek. Zoe reached over and placed a comforting hand on her mother-in-law's arm, playing the supportive daughter role to perfection. Bradley just glared at me with righteous indignation. "It is not too late to do the right thing." "Audrey," my mother pleaded, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "Surrender the corporation. Give Trenton what he paid for. Save your brother from going to federal prison. If you just sign those papers right now, I promise I can find it in my heart to forgive you for this terrible betrayal. We can be a family again. Just sign the intellectual property over to the limited liability company and let us heal from this nightmare." Trenton let out an irritated sigh, immune to her manipulation. He slapped his hand flat against the mahogany table, silencing my mother instantly. "Sit down, Diane." Trenton commanded, his voice dripping with absolute disdain. "I did not come here to listen to a daytime soap opera. I came here for my intellectual property." Trenton shifted his predatory gaze directly onto me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, projecting the full weight of his billionaire authority. "Listen to me very carefully, Audrey," he said, his tone cold and threatening. "I do not care about your childhood paints, and I do not care about your family drama. I care about the $4 million that your family stole from my investment firm. I bought those vector files. I bought those licensing contracts with Apple and Target. I paid for a fully operational digital art empire, and I expect to receive exactly what I paid for. If you do not sign that asset forfeiture agreement in the next 5 minutes, I will unleash my legal team on you. I will tie up your private corporation in so much expensive litigation that you will be completely bankrupt before we ever see the inside of a courtroom." Trenton pointed a rigid finger at the papers resting in the center of the table. "Sign the documents, Audrey. Give me my $4 million worth of assets right now, or I will personally ensure that your lucrative career is permanently destroyed." The entire glass room went completely silent. My parents held their breath, waiting for the billionaire's terrifying threat to finally shatter my resolve. Bradley smirked, convinced that I was completely cornered. Donovan looked incredibly proud of himself, as if his cheap lawsuit had actually orchestrated this entire victory. They all stared at me, expecting me to frantically reach for a pen, apologize for my arrogance, and sign my multi-million-dollar empire away just to escape their combined wrath. Instead of reaching for a pen, I calmly reached for the glass bottle of sparkling water resting near my binder. I unscrewed the metal cap, the quiet hiss of carbonation echoing loudly in the tense boardroom. I slowly poured the sparkling water into my crystal glass, watching the bubbles rise to the surface. I picked up the glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and gently placed it back down onto the coaster. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at my lead attorney, Caldwell, and gave him a polite nod, signaling that it was finally time. Caldwell stood up slowly, ignoring the messy stack of papers Donovan threw onto the table. He did not match the theatrical desperation my mother displayed. Instead, he unlocked his pristine leather briefcase. The metallic click of brass locks echoed in the tense glass boardroom. Caldwell extracted a single crisp sheet of paper. He calmly slid the document directly across the polished mahogany table toward Trenton and his litigators. Mr. Trenton Caldwell, began his voice projecting absolute authority. We are not arguing about intellectual property today because that matter is not up for debate. My client legally owns her assets through a completely separate structure. Since we are discussing the $4 million transaction, I believe your legal team missed a crucial detail during due diligence. Trenton immediately glared at the paper resting directly in front of him. His lead attorney quickly snatched it up, frantically reading the fine print. Donovan scoffed, attempting to sound casually dismissive, but Caldwell instantly silenced him with a freezing look. What you are looking at is the original operating agreement for the limited liability company that Diane sold to you, Caldwell explained smoothly, folding his hands in front of him. It is true that Diane held a 51% paper majority. However, when my client established that entity over a decade ago, she insisted on including a very standard, incredibly strict change of control clause. This clause dictates the precise legal mechanics of how ownership can be transferred. Trenton's lead attorney continued reading, and I watched in real time as the color completely drained from his face. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the legal text, before he slowly handed the paper directly to Trenton. That specific clause, Caldwell continued, his voice echoing perfectly in the silent room, states that any transfer of majority ownership must be accompanied by the explicit notarized written consent of the founding minority shareholder. That would be Audrey. If the majority shares are sold, transferred, or liquidated without her verified signature, the company undergoes an immediate automatic corporate dissolution. It triggers a poison pill. My parents stared at Caldwell, their mouths slightly open in complete confusion. Bradley leaned forward desperately, trying to understand the legal jargon that was rapidly sealing his fate. Zoe just stared at the table, her breathing becoming shallow and panicked. Caldwell leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the mahogany table as he delivered the fatal blow. The moment Diane signed that transfer agreement and accepted your $4 million without Audrey's notarized consent, the limited liability company instantly dissolved. Every single vendor contract, every commercial lease, and every operational capacity that dummy company possessed was immediately and permanently nullified. You did not just buy an empty shell, Mr. Trenton. You bought a legally dead entity. The business ceased to exist the exact second your wire transfer cleared the bank. Trenton stared at the document, the terrifying reality of his monumental financial mistake finally sinking in. He had handed $4 million to a desperate suburban family for a business entity that literally self-destructed the moment he touched it. He turned to his lead attorney, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Is this true? Did you idiots overlook a standard change of control dissolution clause? The highly paid corporate attorney looked absolutely terrified. He nodded slowly, unable to make eye contact with his furious billionaire boss. It is legally binding, sir, the attorney whispered. The entity is completely void. Donovan suddenly jumped up, his face flushed red with panic. Now wait just a minute, Donovan stammered frantically, waving his hands in the air. That cannot be right. You cannot just hide a poison pill in a standard operating agreement and expect it to hold up in a court of equity. We have a civil lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty. Caldwell let out a sharp, condescending laugh that completely humiliated the cheap strip mall lawyer. Sit down and be quiet, Donovan Caldwell snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. This is basic Delaware corporate law, something you might have learned if you did not get your legal degree from the back of a matchbook. Your frivolous lawsuit is completely irrelevant. You cannot sue a minority shareholder for breach of fiduciary duty on behalf of a company that legally does not exist anymore. The absolute finality of Caldwell's words hung heavily in the air. The illusion was entirely shattered. My family had marched into this luxurious boardroom believing they held the ultimate leverage. They thought their cheap lawsuit and my mother's fake tears would force me to surrender my multi-million-dollar empire. Instead, they were sitting in the wreckage of their own profound stupidity. They had sold a poisoned asset, and the trap had just snapped shut on all of them. Trenton did not speak for a very long time. He simply stared at the single sheet of paper resting on the polished mahogany table. The billionaire investor was a man who built his entire fortune on ruthless efficiency and ironclad contracts. To realize that he had just handed $4 million to a desperate suburban family for an absolutely worthless dissolved entity was a level of professional humiliation he had never experienced. His face slowly turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck began to bulge against the crisp white collar of his custom-tailored shirt. When he finally lifted his eyes away from the legal document, he did not look at me or my attorney Caldwell. Trenton turned his terrifying, predatory gaze entirely onto my family. Diane shrank back into her leather chair, pulling her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, as if it could somehow protect her from the impending explosion. Richard opened his mouth to offer another pathetic excuse, but Trenton instantly cut him off. "You stole from me!" Trenton growled, his voice vibrating with a dark, suppressed fury that echoed loudly through the glass boardroom. "You sat here in my office. You looked me directly in the eyes and sold me a poisoned asset. You committed federal wire fraud." Trenton stood up from his chair, towering over my terrified parents and my completely paralyzed brother. "I do not care about your ridiculous family dynamics or your pathetic strip mall lawyer," Trenton declared, pointing a thick finger directly at Bradley's pale face. "I want my money back. I want the entire $4 million wired back into my holding account by the end of business hours today." Donovan, the cheap lawyer, began sweating profusely. He frantically wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He nervously tried to intervene. "Now, Mr. Trenton," Donovan stammered. "My clients acted in good faith. They did not understand the complex legal mechanisms of the change of control clause. We can certainly negotiate a reasonable repayment schedule to resolve this misunderstanding." Trenton slammed his heavy fists down on the table, making the entire glass room shake violently. "There is no negotiation," he roared, completely shattering Donovan's pathetic defense. "There is no repayment schedule. You will return my $4 million immediately, and you will add an additional $1 million to that wire transfer to cover the punitive damages. You will pay those legal fees and compensate me for the absolute waste of my professional time. $5 million total paid today, or every single one of you will be arrested for felony fraud before the sun goes down." The staggering demand of $5 million hung heavily in the suffocating air of the boardroom. Diane quickly turned to Bradley, her face stretched into a frantic, desperate mask of false hope. "Bradley," she whispered urgently, grabbing his arm, "just give him the money back. Just wire the $4 million back to his account right now so we leave. We can figure out the rest of the damages later. Just give him the seed capital back so we do not go to prison." Bradley did not move. He stared blankly at the polished table, his breathing becoming incredibly shallow and rapid. A thick layer of cold sweat coated his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Zoe suddenly let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide with absolute horror, as her brain finally processed the catastrophic financial reality of their situation. "Bradley," Zoe choked out, her voice trembling. "Tell them we still have the money. Tell them we can send it back." But Bradley just slowly shook his head, looking like a man who was about to face a firing squad. "We do not have the $4 million. Bradley confessed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. The room went completely still. "What do you mean you do not have it?" Richard demanded, his patriarchal authority entirely replaced by blind panic. "You only got the money just 2 weeks ago. We spent all of it." Zoe suddenly screamed, unable to contain the terrifying truth anymore. She buried her face in her hands, her carefully crafted image of a wealthy tech executive completely disintegrating. In less than 14 days, the Golden Child and his brilliant chief marketing officer had burned through a massive fortune. They locked themselves into a 5-year commercial lease for the massive Class A office space in Soho, paying $600,000 up front. They paid $200,000 for the custom Porsche. They spent another $400,000 on Cartier diamond jewelry and lavish parties. Over $1.2 million was completely squandered, leaving them doomed to federal prison. Trenton did not even scream when he heard the staggering amount they had already spent. The pure explosive rage that had colored his face just moments ago suddenly vanished, replaced by a chilling absolute disgust. He slowly straightened his posture, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked at them as if they were nothing more than insects squashed on the bottom of his expensive leather shoes. "You have until the banks close today," Trenton stated with an eerie, deadpan calm. "If my holding account is short by a single dollar, my attorneys will dial the federal authorities. Enjoy your final afternoon of freedom." He turned on his heel and walked out of the glass boardroom, his legal team quickly following close behind. The heavy doors shut with a definitive click, leaving my family trapped inside the soundproof glass cage with Caldwell and me. The second Trenton was gone, the fragile alliance holding my family together instantly, violently snapped. Zoe shot out of her leather chair so fast that it tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. She turned toward Bradley, her eyes wide and manic, her chest heaving with uncontrolled panic and raw fury. "You are a complete fraud!" Zoe shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You told me this was a legitimate seed round. You told me you were a brilliant tech visionary. You are nothing but a pathetic, incompetent failure who does not even know how to write a single line of code." Bradley flinched as if he had been struck. He raised his hands defensively, trying to calm his furious wife. "Zoe, please calm down," Bradley begged, his voice cracking pitifully. "We can figure this out. I can pitch to other investors. We can raise the capital to pay him back. We just need a little more time." "Pitch to who?" Zoe screamed, stepping so close to him that he shrank back into his chair. "You do not have a product, Bradley. You do not have an artificial intelligence startup. You do not have anything. You just played dress-up in a rented Soho office using your sister's money. You are a fake chief executive officer. You are a child pretending to be a man, and now you are going to drag me into a federal prison cell because you were too stupid to read a basic legal contract." Diane could not tolerate hearing her precious golden child verbally destroyed. She jumped to her feet, her maternal instincts kicking in to protect the son she had idolized for 30 years. "Stop yelling at your husband," Diane commanded, pointing a trembling finger at her daughter-in-law. "Bradley did his best. We all made a mistake. You gladly spent that money too, Zoe. You are wearing designer clothes bought with that same exact cash. Do not stand there and act like you are completely innocent. You need to support him right now instead of acting like a hysterical child." Zoe turned her head toward my mother. The sheer venom in her eyes was genuinely terrifying to witness. "I am wearing clothes you bought me with stolen funds," Zoe hissed, stepping away from Bradley and closing the distance between herself and my mother. "You are the one who initiated this fraudulent sale, Diane. You are the one who constantly babied this pathetic excuse for a man, bailing him out of every single failure until he genuinely believed he was a genius. You raised a useless, entitled parasite who cannot even pay for his own dinner without using his mommy's credit card or his sister's intellectual property." Diane gasped, clutching her pearls in genuine shock. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Diane sputtered, her face turning a blotchy red. "After everything this family has done for you." "This family is a complete joke," Zoe roared back, shattering the pristine suburban illusion they maintained for decades. "You are no wealthy dynasty. You are just a group of pathetic liars who finally got caught trying to steal from the only person in this room who actually works for a living." Zoe pointed a sharp finger directly at me, acknowledging my success for the first time in her life. My father Richard sat frozen in his chair, completely emasculated and utterly silent. He had no control over the chaotic screaming match happening right in front of him. Bradley buried his face in his hands and began to openly sob the heavy, ugly tears of a golden child who realized his shiny armor was actually made of cheap plastic. The perfect, loving family image that my parents had weaponized against me for my entire life was completely annihilated. Caldwell and I simply sat at the end of the long mahogany table, quietly watching the spectacular implosion of their world. The echo of my mother and sister-in-law screaming finally began to fade into a heavy silence. Bradley continued to sob into his hands, the harsh reality of $5 million in debt breaking his mind. Zoe stood over him, glaring down at the pathetic man she had married just 2 years ago. The blinding rage in her eyes shifted into a cold, terrifying calculation. You could see the gears turning in her head as she processed the legal implications of being bound to a man who committed a massive federal crime. Zoe was a woman who married exclusively for status and luxury. The man sitting in front of her was now a massive financial anchor, about to drag her down to the bottom of the ocean. The marital debt would completely ruin her life. She reached up to her neck, grabbing the thick diamond Cartier necklace that had been her ultimate prize just a week ago. With a violent yank, she unclasped the heavy jewelry. She did not hand it back gracefully. She threw it directly at Bradley's face. The sparkling diamonds hit his shoulder hard and clattered loudly onto the polished mahogany table sliding toward my mother. "I am completely done with you," Zoe announced, her voice dripping with absolute venom and sheer disgust. "I am calling my attorney the exact second I leave this building. I am filing for divorce today, Bradley. I will not let you and your pathetic family drag me into a federal prison cell because you were too stupid to run a real business. You can rot in jail by yourself." Bradley lifted his tear-stained face, looking at his wife in pure, desperate disbelief. "Zoe, you cannot leave me right now," he pleaded pathetically, reaching a shaking hand out toward her arm. "We are married. We are supposed to be a team. You gladly spent that money too. You told me you believed in my vision. Do not ever touch me." Zoe shrieked violently, slapping his hand away. "We are not a team. You lied to me about your success. You made me an accessory to federal wire fraud. I am leaving you forever, and I am taking the Miami blue Porsche with me. Consider it my permanent severance package and appropriate compensation for the severe emotional damages you and your toxic mother have inflicted upon me over the last 2 years." Before Bradley could even formulate a pathetic response to her absurd demand, the heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open again. Trenton's lead litigator stepped back into the room. He had briefly remained in the hallway to instruct his paralegals and returned to place a formal physical copy of the $5 million demand letter directly onto the table. He paused near the door, looking at Zoe with an expression of profound, cynical amusement. "Excuse me," the litigator said smoothly, his professional voice slicing right through the thick, emotional tension of the room. "I could not help but overhear your dramatic exit strategy. You specifically mentioned taking the custom Porsche." Zoe crossed her arms defiantly, lifting her chin high. "Yes, I am taking the car," she snapped, attempting to project her usual arrogant authority. "It is registered solely in my name. It belongs entirely to me. It is the absolute least I deserve for wasting my youth with this complete fraud of a husband." The corporate litigator let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He walked slowly over to the table and casually dropped the thick legal envelope right next to the discarded diamond necklace. "That is absolutely not how federal wire fraud works, Ma," he explained calmly, completely destroying her final desperate delusion. "That vehicle was purchased entirely with defrauded investment capital. The fact that your name is on the registration only makes you legally complicit in the active laundering of stolen corporate funds." Zoe's arrogant posture instantly crumbled into dust. "What exactly do you mean?" she stammered, her voice suddenly losing all of its aggressive volume and toxic confidence. "I mean that the Porsche does not belong to you at all." The litigator continued, his tone turning ice cold and incredibly sharp. "It belongs to my client. In fact, every single asset you purchased in the last 2 weeks legally belongs to my client. The commercial lease in Soho, the designer clothes currently sitting in your closet, and that expensive piece of jewelry resting on the table. My firm has already filed the necessary paperwork with the federal authorities this morning. The marshals will be seizing that vehicle today. If you attempt to hide the car or drive it out of the state, you will immediately be hit with additional federal charges. You are walking away with absolutely nothing. Have a truly pleasant afternoon walking home. The corporate litigator turned and walked out of the glass boardroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. Through the thick glass walls, we clearly saw Trenton standing in the hallway. He was holding his cell phone to his ear. His lead attorney stood next to him holding a thick file folder. Even through the soundproof glass, the reality of the situation was painfully obvious. Trenton was not waiting until the end of the business day. He was dialing federal authorities to report the massive wire fraud. The $5 million demand was just a formal legal procedure. He knew they had no money. He was initiating the criminal investigation immediately. Zoe stared at the open doorway, completely paralyzed. She looked down at the empty spot on her neck where the Cartier necklace used to rest, then looked at Bradley with absolute loathing. Without saying another word, she picked up her designer purse and walked out of the boardroom. She did not look back. She left her husband crying at the table, stepping out into the cold reality of her ruined life. As Zoe disappeared down the mahogany corridor, the sheer terror finally broke my parents completely. The arrogant facade they had maintained for my entire life instantly evaporated. My mother Diane let out a guttural, desperate sob. She stumbled away from the table, her legs completely giving out beneath her. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor right next to my chair. A second later, my father Richard fell down right beside her. My parents, the two people who had spent 33 years demanding my absolute submission, were now literally kneeling on the floor in front of me. It was the ultimate power shift. The patriarchal authority my father always wielded, and the toxic maternal guilt my mother always weaponized, were completely gone. They were just two terrified, broken criminals begging for their lives. Audrey, please, my mother wailed, grabbing the fabric of my coat with trembling hands. I am begging you. Look at me. I am your mother. You cannot let them send us to federal prison. We will not survive it. We are too old. Bradley will not survive it. Please, Audrey. You have to save your family. My father was openly weeping now, heavy tears streaming down his wrinkled face. He reached out and tried to grab my hand, but I calmly pulled it away and rested it on the table. Audrey, I am so sorry. Richard choked out, his voice thick with panic and humiliation. We made a terrible mistake. We were blinded by the money. We wanted Bradley to succeed so badly that we lost our minds. I know we treated you terribly. I know we took you for granted. But we are your blood. You cannot just sit there and watch your own flesh and blood go to jail. I looked down at them kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity. There was no sadness. There was just a profound sense of closure. You can fix this right now, Diane pleaded, her mascara running down her face in thick black streaks. Just tell your lawyer to draft a new contract. Give Trenton the intellectual property. He said he just wants the digital assets. You are so talented, Audrey. You can always draw more pictures. You can build another company. You have your whole life ahead of you. But if you do not sign those files over to him right now, our lives are completely over. Do it for the family, Audrey. Please do it for the family. Bradley had stopped crying and was now watching us from the table. Even in his absolute lowest moment, he did not have the courage to get on his knees himself. He let his elderly parents beg for his freedom. He just stared at me with desperate, pathetic eyes, silently hoping I would sacrifice my multi-million-dollar empire to save him from his own fraudulent actions. Mr. Caldwell sat perfectly still next to me. He did not interrupt. He allowed the spectacular humiliation to unfold, knowing exactly how important this moment was for my psychological freedom. I looked at my mother, whose hands were still clutching my coat. I looked at my father, who was staring up at me with red, swollen eyes. They were using the word family as a weapon one last time. They genuinely believed that the biological tie between us was a magical lever they could pull to force my compliance. They thought that seeing them physically kneeling on the floor would trigger a deep, conditioned response of daughterly obedience. I slowly reached down and firmly peeled my mother's trembling hands off my coat. I smoothed the fabric, sat in my leather chair, and prepared to deliver my answer. I looked down at the two people kneeling on the floor before me. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to believe that their approval was the most valuable currency in the world. I spent decades trying to earn their respect, trying to prove that my art was a legitimate career, trying to show them I was just as worthy of their love as my brother. But looking at them now stripped of their arrogant authority and reduced to crying heaps on a corporate boardroom floor, I realized I did not want their respect or their forced apologies anymore. I shifted my gaze directly to my father. "You talk about flesh and blood, Richard," I said, my voice incredibly calm, but carrying a sharp edge that made him flinch. "Where was that deep loyalty when you were drilling a new lock into my apartment door? Where was that family bond when you handed me 2 garbage bags full of my clothes and told me I was cut out of your life unless I surrendered to his delusions? You were perfectly fine with watching me become homeless. You only care about blood now because you are the ones bleeding out." My father squeezed his eyes shut completely, unable to look at me. My mother sobbed louder, reaching her hands out again, but stopping before she actually touched me. "And you, Diane." I continued, turning my attention to the woman who had spent 33 years chipping away at my self-esteem. "You want me to do this for the family. You want me to sacrifice a multi-million-dollar digital art empire to save a family that maliciously sold my life away while I was in Paris. You sat at that upscale restaurant, drinking expensive wine, celebrating that cruel theft. You looked me right in the eye and told me that my brother was a genius while I just drew pictures on an iPad." I pointed across the large table at Bradley, who was still sitting in his chair, frozen in absolute cowardice. "Look at your tech genius, Mom," I commanded, my voice echoing off the soundproof glass walls. "Look at the brilliant visionary you sacrificed your daughter to protect. He could not even handle a simple due diligence review. He blew over $1 million on luxury cars and expensive office space in 14 days without verifying anything important. He never bothered reading a single legal document because you taught him that consequences do not apply to him. He is not a victim of corporate sabotage. He is exactly the entitled, incompetent parasite you raised him to be." Bradley let out a pathetic whimper, but he did not speak to defend himself. He knew every word I said was the absolute truth. "Audrey, please," Diane whispered, her voice completely hoarse and broken. "We have absolutely nothing left to give him. They will send us to federal prison. We will die in there. You have to save us right now." I stood up slowly from my leather chair, smoothing the front of my blazer. Mr. Caldwell mirrored my movement, picking up his pristine briefcase and quietly buttoning his suit jacket. I looked down at my kneeling parents one final time, feeling the last remaining invisible thread between us completely snap. "You told me I could paint anywhere, so I am going to paint a beautiful future where I do not know you. You sold your soul for a golden child who could not even read a contract. Now you get to pay the absolute maximum price for your terrible actions." I did not wait for their pathetic response. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. Caldwell opened the thick door for me, and I stepped out into the quiet mahogany corridor. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not pause to listen to my mother's agonized wailing or my father's desperate, pathetic apologies echoing from inside that cold glass room. I kept my head held high as I marched away, leaving them completely alone with the terrifying consequences of their own massive greed and profound, arrogant financial stupidity. I walked straight toward the private elevator, feeling an immense, suffocating weight completely lift off my shoulders. I was finally free from their toxic grasp. I pressed the glowing button and waited for the doors to open. The quiet chime of the elevator signaled the absolute end of my previous life and the beginning of a brilliant new chapter. I stepped inside the metal car, pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, I left them alone inside that boardroom, leaving them entirely to the ruthless corporate wolves they had eagerly invited into their own vulnerable home. 3 months later, the morning sun warmed the sleek hardwood floors of my Tribeca loft. I stood in my expansive kitchen, listening to the gentle hum of my espresso machine. The city below was waking up alive with the vibrant energy of millions of people rushing to their jobs. I poured the rich, dark espresso into a ceramic mug and carried it over to my kitchen island. I sat down and tapped the screen of my digital tablet to pull up the morning financial news. My life had settled into a beautiful, productive rhythm since that fateful day in Trenton's glass boardroom. The suffocating anxiety that used to define my daily existence was completely gone, replaced by the thrilling momentum of my expanding digital art empire. I took a slow sip of my coffee and scrolled through the local New York business section. It did not take long to find exactly what I was looking for. The headline was buried a few pages deep, but it was unmistakably clear. Local tech founder indicted in multi-million-dollar venture capital fraud. I tapped the article and a poorly lit photograph of my brother Bradley filled the screen. He looked absolutely terrible. He was walking down the stone steps of a federal courthouse, surrounded by aggressive reporters. He was no longer wearing his expensive custom-tailored suits or his sleek black turtleneck. He wore a cheap wrinkled blazer, and his face was pale and gaunt. The article detailed how the federal authorities had formally charged him with 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of criminal conspiracy to defraud an investor. Trenton had kept his terrifying promise. He unleashed his elite legal team, and the federal prosecutors eagerly took the slam dunk case. Bradley was currently out on a heavily restricted bail, awaiting a criminal trial that would undoubtedly end with a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. His grand illusion of being a brilliant tech visionary had completely evaporated, leaving him exposed as a pathetic, incompetent criminal. I scrolled further down the page, reading the grim details of the financial fallout. The federal government had aggressively seized every single asset connected to the fraudulent $4 million wire transfer. Because my parents had signed the original limited liability company contract and directly facilitated the illegal sale, they were held entirely financially liable for the massive missing funds. My mother, Diane, and my father, Richard, were completely bankrupted. They lost everything they had spent decades building. The article briefly mentioned the seizure of their assets, but my corporate lawyer, Caldwell, had given me the specific details just last week. Their pristine suburban home, the house where I grew up, and was constantly told I would never amount to anything, was officially foreclosed by the bank. They were forcibly evicted by the local sheriff's department, and their remaining possessions were auctioned off to pay down a fraction of Trenton's punitive damages. They were currently renting a tiny, dilapidated apartment in a terrible neighborhood, relying entirely on my father's meager Social Security checks just to buy groceries. The consequences for Zoe were equally devastating and profoundly satisfying. When she dramatically announced her divorce in that glass boardroom, she genuinely believed she could just walk away clean. She thought she could abandon Bradley and seamlessly transition to her next wealthy target. But the federal marshals did not care about her divorce filings. They seized her custom-painted Miami blue Porsche the very next morning, right out of her luxury apartment parking garage. Furthermore, the massive credit card debt she had recklessly racked up during her 2-week stint as the fake chief marketing officer remained entirely in her name. Since the corporate bank accounts were permanently frozen, she was personally responsible for every designer dress, every expensive dinner, and every piece of luxury jewelry she had purchased. To avoid total bankruptcy, she was forced to get a job. Caldwell informed me that the former chief marketing officer was now working full-time at a cheap retail clothing store in a suburban shopping mall. Her minimum wage earnings were aggressively garnished by her creditors, leaving her with barely enough money to survive. I finished reading the article, and calmly closed the web browser. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or sadness for any of them. They had built their own destructive trap and eagerly stepped right into it. I picked up my digital stylus and opened my design software, completely ready to start working on a massive new floral campaign for Apple. The bright morning light filled my multi-million-dollar loft, illuminating the beautiful life I had built with my own two hands. Their fragile house of cards had finally collapsed forever, and I was the only one left standing victorious. Exactly 6 months after that quiet morning in New York, I found myself standing on a wrought iron balcony overlooking the vibrant streets of Paris. The crisp autumn air carried the rich scent of freshly baked pastries and roasted coffee from the bustling cafes below. I took a deep breath, letting the romantic atmosphere of the city completely fill my lungs. I was not just visiting the French capital on a temporary artist retreat anymore. I had returned to the exact same historic neighborhood where I first received that frantic phone call about my stolen business. But this time, I did not just rent a small room. Using the massive influx of capital from my finalized licensing contracts with Apple and Target, my corporate holding company outright purchased the entire historic residency building. The beautiful five-story limestone structure was now completely mine. I converted the entire top floor into a massive private studio featuring soaring glass skylights that bathed my digital drafting tables in perfect natural light. I stepped back inside my studio, sliding the heavy glass balcony doors shut. My lead assistant, a brilliant local design student named Camille, handed me a steaming cup of tea and a printed portfolio of our latest digital floral patterns. I thanked her and walked over to my massive drafting table. I traced my fingers over the sleek surface, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. The relentless anxiety, the constant need to prove my worth, the suffocating pressure of my parents' expectations, they were all permanently erased from my life. I was completely independent, incredibly wealthy, and entirely free. My business, Audrey's Vault Incorporated, was expanding globally. We were hiring talented artists, opening new creative divisions, and signing international distribution deals. I was no longer just the quiet girl drawing on an iPad in the corner of a cramped apartment. I was the undisputed chief executive officer of a digital art empire. I set my tea down and looked at a large blank canvas resting on an easel in the corner of the room. For my entire life, I had been repeatedly told that my family was my foundation. My mother and father constantly preached that blood loyalty was the absolute most important thing in the world. They used the concept of family as a heavy iron chain to keep me tethered to their toxic dynamic. They expected me to endlessly sacrifice my own happiness, my financial security, and my creative passion just to keep my brother comfortable in his delusions of grandeur. But sitting in my Parisian studio, surrounded by the tangible results of my own relentless hard work, I finally understood the truth about growth. If you want to grow a massive, beautiful tree, you need strong roots. But if those roots are buried in poison soil, if they are actively drawing up toxic sludge that rots the trunk from the inside out, you have to make a brutal choice. You can either stay connected to that poison and slowly wither away, or you can take a sharp axe and sever those rotten roots completely. Cutting off my family was the most painful, terrifying thing I ever had to do. But the exact moment I swung that axe and severed my connection to their toxic entitlement, I finally started to grow. I reached the sunlight. I bloomed in ways I never thought were possible. I stopped letting their profound insecurities dictate my ultimate potential. Blood does not automatically grant someone a permanent VIP pass to your life, especially when they only show up to rob the vault. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to build a titanium fortress around your heart, your mind, and your hard-earned assets. You are allowed to walk away from the people who only love you when you are convenient and easily controlled. I picked up my digital stylus, ready to create something entirely new and beautifully unburdened by the ghosts of my past. I finally possessed the immense power to craft my own beautiful destiny without any external interference dragging me down into darkness. My future was a completely blank canvas, and I was the only person holding the brush. I smiled, looking directly into the camera lens with absolute unshakable confidence. They thought they could sell my life to fund his delusion. Instead, they ultimately bought their own ruin. If you've ever had to legally outsmart a toxic family member, let me know in the comments. Hit subscribe for more satisfying justice, and remember to always protect your vault. Because sometimes the most beautiful masterpiece you will ever create is the completely independent life you build after walking away from the people who tried to destroy you. Stay strong, stay smart, and never let anyone steal your vision.